So, good evening to the 11th International Athens Poetry Festival. I'm so delighted to be here with some of the three most exciting young poets writing today. All award-winning, all translators, all cradling languages and countries. Ms. Valžina Mort, originally from Belarus, now living and teaching in the United States. Mr. Jan Wagner from Germany, wonderful translator, exciting translator living in Berlin. And Ms. Eftichia Panayot from Cyprus, originally living and working in Greece at the moment. As I said, all translators, all award-winning poets. So we're going to talk about poetry today. We're going to talk about translation today. We're going to talk about voice and register, but we're also going to talk about the state of the world, because we live in a very troubled time. And I'm curious. It sort of seems, all three of you, that this is an age not just of geopolitical and political turbulence, but also of moral turbulence. It seems that the moral givens of our post-World War II conditions have been shaken. And that makes us feel a bit unsafe, in a sense. We don't know what's coming. We don't know what the new moral scale might be, or how the tables will turn. And I wonder, is there any room for poetry in this troubled moral world that is dawning? Jan, for example?
Well, personally, I think there's always room for poetry, no matter what the times are. And although, of course, people have been wishing for poetry to go away and have been saying that poetry doesn't matter anymore in our world, I think the opposite is true. Because from the beginning of time, poems have offered an opportunity to get to terms with the world, to be soothed by poetry, and to get a grip on things, and also I think an invitation to think the world anew. So what better in a time of turmoil than a poem to invite you to be thrilled by language, to be absorbed by beauty, but also motivated to think anew and to get a new perspective on things. I think poems are made for times like these.
Well, no, please go ahead. No. Valžina,
I was able to add that times have always been troublesome,
yes,
of course, and what times haven't been troublesome and full of turmoil.
Well, sometimes have been more quiet in the past than...
That might be true.
We live in an interesting age, as the Chinese say. It's a curse.
Yeah.
It's a curse. To live in an interesting era is a Chinese curse. But Valžina, I'm wondering what your thoughts on Jan's take is, not just for poets themselves and dedicated poetry audiences, but for people as a whole. Do you think people turn to poetry? People who maybe don't read poetry in general. Do you think people turn to poetry in times of turmoil like this?
I do agree with Jan. I think that the moral givens that are shaken today are shaken in many ways because we realize that they were always shaken and they were always rather illusionary. And to quote, but maybe I'm really butchering it, great German language poet Ingmar Bachmann, that wars are no longer declared, they only continued. Isn't that Bachmann?
I think
Yeah. So I think there was always a violence somewhere, and there is the quietude is rather illusionary. And as for the room, I'm thinking of a great Belarusian writer Svetlana Alexievich, who likes to repeat that it takes a very small scratch for the skin of culture to start bleeding and to show the animal that is underneath it, that this skin of quietude and peace is very, very thin. I think that poetry always comforts whoever needs comfort, and hopefully it also disturbs whoever needs to be disturbed. So it's there for that. But I think that it's true that statistically more people turn to poetry during the times of turmoil, because people get bombarded by so much noise, social-political noise, and I think that a poem is a break from that noise.
I would definitely agree so, in the sense that, you know, poets have to work in nuance, which is so not what social media works in at this time, and very often large media outlets as well, working with clickbait techniques. But Evgenia, you come from a historically troubled country to a certain sense. What is your take on what is going on politically?
Okay. Well, I agree with the Jan Valsina. I think that poetry can work as an inner refuge, and it works a little bit secretly. So there are a lot of people who read and write and communicate, and they create this very wonderful space of goodness, this chain of goodness. And there's always this gesture that connects poetry to politics. I think it's caring, and I think that poetry can be an act of caring, caring for every creature, I mean human beings. Poetry can use and create a language that is actually expressing collective pain and grief, as well as personal, of course. Poetry can always, of course, poetry cannot rewrite the rules of the world, but can also create worlds and create alternative worlds and think of the world in a different way. So, yeah, coming from a divided country, well, I've grew up with a feeling of maybe having suffered enough, as did older people. So this helped me cultivate some kind of empathy for people who have suffered. So I think that poetry, even though it doesn't have this huge audience, or has wouldn't use the language of the media, can work really, really hard to stay and sustain what is called human consciousness, and stay morally, ethically alert.
That's a wonderfully tender room for poetry in the world. And you're always welcome to pick up the microphone and answer each other. But his take made me think of if poetry creates this room in the world, I'm wondering whether the 21st century can create room for poetry itself. So the other way around, is the way the world going to allow poetry to do all this miraculous stuff that we're doing? What I'm asking, let me be more clear. We're seeing a rise in autocratic regimes trying to censor people, to censor writers, to silence people. I know that in some countries in the world, poetry will always have room to speak, but are you optimistic about the future or not? That's my question.
Do you want to go ahead? Do you mean the future of poetry or the future in
Not
general?
the future of the world, allowing poetry to exist, or arts for that matter, in general.
Yeah.
Creative dissonance to the main narratives. Let's put it this way.
Well, I'm personally very confident as far as poetry is concerned. I mean, it's always been there. I think it will always be there, and it doesn't depend on what's going on technically in terms of progress, technical progress or whatsoever. It's always been there because it's always been a sort of a counterweight to what's going on, and always a source of freedom. I mean, a poem for me really is the greatest possible freedom on the most limited space, which makes it a very ugly object for despots, as you said. But that makes it very suitable for times of despotism, for times of turmoil, and a source of relief for the readers. I think that goes both ways too. And it's good times for writers of poetry and good times for readers of poetry. And one of the miracles of poems, I think, is that they may survive for a long time, sometimes decades, sometimes centuries, to give relief and to soothe readers in a different age, a different country, a different time sphere, by managing to focus some personal grief bound to a certain period of time to the universal grief of mankind. That's what poems can do. A couple of years ago I was invited to, and it happened to be the month when the Ukraine was attacked full scale, and I was invited to a seminar which had been planned for many years already. And this seminar in the United States happened to be a seminar on war poetry, which seemed fitting, but also terrifying. And I was invited, and it seemed like a bad time to leave Europe, but I was there, and we were reading Georg Trakl, the great Austrian poet, and particularly his last poem called Grodek, before he killed himself. That was written a long time ago, but the essence of the poem seemed to be so modern, reading this poem at that point of time, that was terrifying and soothing at the same time. And made the poem suddenly a very modern poem for our times again.
Well, I agree with Jan, although I'm not that positive, optimistic, that optimistic. Well, poetry language is really brilliant because it can escape surveillance, I think. No one understands what a poem actually talks about, or you can rearrange the meaning. We've seen that happening in the past. So, yeah, that's a positive part. On the other side, poetry has never been actually a popular art. It's something that our modern life had created, like we invented this popular poetry that I'm not sure that actually exists. Because a poem needs a special way of reading, it needs to slow down, you need to kind of rearrange the meaning of the poem, as I said before. So it's not that being direct is not the main, characteristic of poetry. So this is the beauty of it. But I'm not. The thing that actually bugs me is that I don't think that there is a lot of time for poetry reading, and I think there's no real time for reading. Generally, I'm speaking about a wider audience, right? Because technology and AI might affect poetry. So basically, I think it's more about tech governance and less about political surveillance that would affect poetry. Yeah, that's.
When you were posing your question, you were describing the current situation of the 21st century, but I thought that this was the description of the 20th century that just refuses to end, and I thought that there are generations of poets who lived through everything you've described and responded to it. And so very quickly I asked myself, what did I learn from those poets? Because some of them it was impossible to learn from because they did not live long, and sometimes their manuscripts were burnt, while others did survive and wrestled with a lot of guilt of survivors in their poems. And so I thought of Czesław Miłosz, the Polish poet who writes about discovering the salutary aim of poetry, that he discovered it too late, that the aim of poetry is to praise. Of course that brings in another Polish poet, Adam Zagajewski, and his much quoted poem that he hated so much. I'm so sorry, Adam. The poem that he hated so much, mentioned all the time to praise the mutilated world.
Which is a lovely poem.
Yeah. So, but it is, the poet is there praising, but also I want to say that it's not the role of poetry to react to the events of the world. It's not a reactionary art. And so it's very important for poets to do their own thing, for poetry to do its own thing, and it also took me in my mind immediately back to Milosz and his poem about the end of the world, in which he imagines the end of the world, which we imagine a lot today too, because the nuclear disaster is on the table again. In this poem, he writes about planting tomatoes on the last day of the world, which I think is a wonderful way on insisting on life and on praise and on yourself, rather than constantly being called to respond.
Okay. Well, in that sense, if the geopolitical situation is not a threat to poetry, what about what you already mentioned, Evtihia, AI? What about artificial intelligence? Not just in terms of, I'm not interested in artificial intelligence writing poetry and whether the poems will be good, but what about a generation growing up right now, learning mostly through artificial intelligence and large-scale systems like ChatGPT, meaning not learning how to appreciate search or other cognitive means of getting knowledge. And how do you think they will be able to appreciate poetry in the future? Such generations that are brought up by being spoon-fed on AI. You know, these are very provocative, maybe they're not, maybe they're boring questions, but I'm trying to be provocative here. So if you disagree, please go right ahead and say so.
Maybe I'll start so that I can disagree. Yeah, I can waltz out of this. Because I hear a lot of very emotional responses and concerns about AI and literature and poetry, but I teach young people. And I teach young people of different generations, and my daughter is a teenager, I know her friends, and my response to the concern, the danger of AI and literature is not very emotional, and I see that these young people understand the value of their own critical thinking. I see that they understand the value of encountering another human being's thinking on the page with language in front of them. And they understand that that's what they get out of literature. And they're not really interested in a machine doing the thinking for them, or at least the young people around me, they're not. And they understand that a poem is an encounter, is an experience of moving through somebody else's thinking and be surprised by the turns that the mind takes. So I'm not concerned. I'm much more concerned as a citizen about privacy, about security, about policing, and AI. So that's my concern. But when it comes to poetry, I think that people who read it, they understand what they come to it for.
I completely share that view. I mean, poetry has always been a thing for a relatively small circle of people. It's always been there, but it's always been the happy few who have been reading poetry. And I think one of the attractions of poetry is that you don't need anything at all. Just you need your own head, you need a pen and a piece of paper maybe, but nothing more, not even a pen and a piece of paper, in order to let your mind float freely and excitingly to other places and make things up. I think the fact that all the poetic strategies that we employ are basically the strategies that every child employs in learning about the world and in talking, metaphor, simile, exaggeration, a pun. Those are all things that everybody learns from the very beginning without AI. So the excitement of language and of imagination is inside everybody. And so the happy few who are interested in this kind of adventure will always know how to differentiate and do the enjoy the simple pleasures of the mind, or the not so simple pleasures of the mind. So I think poetry is not endangered at all by AI. Other things are, I agree, but not poetry. In fact, it's maybe I hear from people that it's getting more attractive.
Yeah, it's
more attractive because it's something almost revolutionarily simple. It's you don't need anything at all. So it's a way of a grain of sand maybe in the great machinery which you can use if you are not willing to participate in the great movements of technology. Anarchistic in a way, in every way.
Luddite, somebody would say, but no, anarchistic, I like that.
Well, I don't know if there's anything I can add. I think that poetry will change. It will be different poetry, but I'm not sure I don't know if poetry will exist, but it's going to be different because usually generations have different way of feeling and grasping reality and expressing themselves, and language will change a little bit. Or maybe it's going to be a poetry that we won't recognize if we're alive. But generally speaking, I do hope that this automated life that some people suggest that would be by AI usage won't affect. Actually, it would be an opportunity to cultivate this human flaws we can see in art. That it is a unique way of expressing yourself, because I think art is not about perfection or ready-mades or replicas. It's all about this special way of seeing how the world works and how you can grasp the historical moments and find this very successful way of describing the world in a very unique way. So basically, maybe our brain will adjust to different critical ways of thinking, but poetry, I think, will still be alive, but in a different way.
I would like to take you all to Belarus and to say that at the same time as people are concerned about AI and are wondering how the way we use language or write poetry would change because of AI, there are people in Belarusian prisons, people who are writers, who are journalists, who are publishers, they're political prisoners right now as we speak. Many of them in solitary confinements, incommunicado prisoners, which means that they have no communication, even with their own lawyers, they have no representation. And what all of them do is write inside their heads. Those that come out share the work they've written inside their head while they were in jail. I have my school friend, Maxim Znak, is in jail and without any communication for several years now, but at the time when he could still see his wife, He dictated to her his the kind of entries of flash fiction, one could say, autofiction, out of jail. And so as we are concerned about AI and all of this new technology, there is a very archaic way of writing without even paper and a pen. It's happening. And it's very important to remember that people are writing on prison walls.
But that book is extraordinary. It's been translated into German as well, and it's really a monument to the powers of imagination and the stubbornness of human imagination. It's lovely. Yeah.
You have totally convinced me on the importance of resistance that lies within poetry, resistance against mono-thought, George Orwell sort of. But I'm concerned about the world that is well-fed and complacent. Our countries, not your country, our countries to the west. How do we get people interested anew in the arts and in poetry and in literature? Because you've been telling me about your wonderful students and about the people who already read poetry, and we've all discussed the fact that it's a small audience, and we see the importance of poetry for the very life of the poets that write it and are behind bars or incommunicado in jails, but how does the complacent world get that message, do you think?
Well, not everybody will want to get that message, and that's perfectly all right. But I think it's our duty and our freedom to write poems that are as good as possible, to convince those that are to be convinced that poetry is a good thing. Poetry written with natural intelligence. And my experience, I mean, it's really a minority not only of writers but of readers as well. But it always has been. But at the same time, I think it's a fact that that the poetry or also the music of language is something essential, which everybody has experienced in his or her time. So the need of poetry is there and is universal. Not everybody knows that it's universal, but I think the potential audience is quite large. And every now and again, and quite often actually, you meet people who tell you at readings that they're only there because it has been raining, or because their partners threatened them to do something awful if they won't go with them to the poetry reading. And they said they have been maltreated with sonnets in their school time and thought they would never read a poem again. But now they have noticed that actually this is quite liberating, and it gives them something to think about. And it has opened a perspective of the world they had hitherto not seen at all. And that they now continue to read poetry. So I think there's a great potential of people who not yet know that they love poetry, but they will someday for sure.
Okay.
As Valsina said before, I think there will always be people writing poetry or writing something that sounds like poetry is using like the freedom of language and the tone and the diversity of language in order to express some thoughts and feelings that are unique and kind of different than the norms and the uniform way of acting and thinking. However, to be quite honest, I won't be that sad if poetry doesn't exist in the future, because maybe it won't be any need to write poetry. I don't know. I mean, publishing poetry. We might end up having poetry in our life, like in stories and in songs, rhyming, but it doesn't need to be like a published, publishing poetry. It can be more private, in a sense. What I'm saying is that I think that poetry is very, it gives us a glimmer of hope, but it doesn't have to be that public. I mean, why would we have to convince someone that poetry is important? I mean, it's very silly in a sense. It's very, I don't know, it's suffocating in a sense. However, I think that the key issue is influencing young people and getting to know the way they think and getting to grasp this way of their sensitivity in order maybe to make some, let's say, a therapeutic side effect of poetry. Because there is something therapeutic in writing poetry, and there is something very useful in terms of living well. So, if there wouldn't be a published poetry, if I wouldn't mind not publishing books, but I would mind if people weren't interested in having the sensitivity or to act in a sense that is very humane and very positive within society.
Well, for many, many centuries, poetry was not published. It was oral.
Yeah, exactly.
So, in that sense, yes, we can go back to that model. Maybe publishing individual books is it's a late, it's a post-enlightenment. Obviously, it is a post-enlightenment hobby, but I don't know. It's okay. I'm thinking about it as well. Let me go back a bit. Something very, very, very basic, because as poets, we're all passionate about poetry. But how did each and every one of you answer the call of poetry? Why are you not prose writers? Why are you? Why are you poets? Why are you, writers in the first place?
And every time I see my royalty statement, this is exactly the question I ask myself. Why am I not a novelist? Why am I not a non-fiction writer? Why am I not a writer of historical biographies, or detective stories, or romance novels? Yes, that's a very good question.
So why? Or you haven't answered it, I don't know.
Why I'm a poet? Because I'm a failed musician, maybe. Because I'm also a failed opera singer. So a lot of failures, a lot of musical failures led me to poetry.
Fair enough.
I think that's an answer given quite often by poets, really.
Yes.
And of some who said, I wish I could paint, but I can't, so I write poems. Yeah. There are quite a few. Joke Hein did that, and others. I think Starkey as well. Anyway, I think for me it was the fact that I loved reading poetry. It's really that I did read novels as well, and my parents read stories to me in fairy tales and novels, and let me choose from their library books. But the effect that poetry had on me was profound. It was just an exhilarating experience, because I experienced something which I never had experienced with novels, which I liked, and I still read novels occasionally, although I don't write novels. But to read a poem and to be thrilled or intoxicated by language, and at the same time to get the impression that you see as clearly as never before. That was something completely new to me, and I wanted to find out how they do it. How does Georg Trakl do it, or Rilke do it, or Ingemar Bachmann, or Miłosz? All these people I then read, and that really thrilled me and made me very receptive for poetry. And from that point on, I wanted to know how they do it and try to copy all these people. Plus, I had a good teacher. We haven't mentioned teachers so far, but they, of course, are the people who can explain why poetry may, fill a void in your life, or how poetry may contribute to having a good existence on this planet. And my teacher was very enthusiastic about English language poetry, and he would come in and wouldn't give us a poem to read, but say, listen to this. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. And we were thinking, who's that? And we said, that's William Blake. And so we were hooked on Blake.
Wonderful. I was hooked on
Amongst
Shakespeare.
others.
It's not exactly poetry, but it is poetic theatre. So, what about you, Evdokia?
I think that I didn't grow up in an environment where education and arts were taken for granted. So I kind of found poetry like later on. I think I was always writing because writing doesn't cost anything and you can actually practice writing secretly. So that was a way out to an artistic world. But I think the turning point was when it was during university when I started philosophy, and I started realizing that philosophy won't help me solve my problems.
Thank you.
It's a rigid, field. So of course, reading poetry and writing poetry was stimulating because you think that you create something from zero. So it's very. It's very thrilling. I don't know if you remember a book by George Steiner. It's called 10 Possible Reasons for the Melancholy of Thought, if I'm putting it correctly. So I just wanted to write down in accuracy what I thought. So that was very relieving. So poetry I don't know why poetry. Maybe it's it was my it's a mindset. It's a way of thinking. So it was more easy to be compact and metaphorical, and less filling less pages. I think.
Evdokia and Jan gave very serious answers, so I feel like I do not want to come across as somebody who takes poetry not seriously.
Nobody who reads you can think that. But go ahead.
But I listed all of these different prose genres, and I would say that I read all of them, except for perhaps romance stories. And I would read a history book, and I enjoy it, but at the end, I'm still dissatisfied. Something is missing for me. I would read a novel, and again, I want something else. And I think that I'm a poet because a story is never enough for me. A poem gives that experience of exactly what Jan was describing, of total estrangement from storytelling, from language, and from the world. And yet, it's not at all strange or original. Instead, it's this remarkable clarity and precision of a poem that I find totally satisfying. And I think that unlike prose, poetry doesn't always come out of a narrative or even language, but I think that, so for me the first poet was not Homer, but Philomena, the one who was raped by her brother-in-law, and then her tongue was cut so that she could not tell the story. And then she went and she created a tapestry that told the story. For me, that's a story of poetry, and how a poet has to transform the narrative as if there was no narrative and as if there was no language, actually, as if there was no tongue. And it has to come out of this sense of total muteness, in which a language is invented and renewed. And yet it's nothing, original or unique. It's just the ability to reach amazing clarity and precision.
I can only think back to to the Greek word for poetry, which is poiesis, which means creation. It's the exact same word. When you write poetry, you create. So it rounds up with what you said. But since we're talking about this creation or renewal of the world, this coming out of muteness, this, and you're all translators, and you're all extremely competent in at least one more language, English, obviously, and more than one, perhaps. And you're all translators. I'm wondering in what way your translation practice enriches or enroaches in your actual poetry writing, whether it has good effects, bad effects, whether it teaches you something new, whether your poetry fits into your translation. So what is your own individual experience as a poet and a translator? How do these two roles blend and they make you up, the individual you?
Well, this is a difficult question, I think. I don't consider myself a professional translator, meaning that it's not what I do for a living. And I usually choose the poets I love, I fall in love with, to translate. So I guess there's some affinity from the beginning. And at the same time, there's this attempt to capture and understand, as a reader, the poems written by some poet. But I'm not sure what's going on there with influence, and I can't really answer the question. But I really consider translation of poetry a very difficult and overwhelming work. So that's the reason I'm not practicing it that often, because it's an attempt to transmit a different voice in your own language. So it's quite overwhelming. I did that with Anne Sexton when I was very young, and that was good because when you're young you don't really understand the danger of the attempt. And it was quite difficult with Anne Carson as well. And even the Romantics were extremely hard because it's a different era and it's a different ethical, view.
I've got one. Well, for me, writing poetry and translating poetry blends perfectly. I started translating when I was studying in Dublin, and I learned about Louis MacNeice, a lovely Northern Irish poet who hadn't been translated to that point into German. And I liked his poetry a lot, and started translating him. One motive was to share my enthusiasm with readers of German who couldn't read English and whom I wanted to give a chance to enjoy MacNeice as much as I did in English. But I quickly discovered that writing poetry and translating poetry go hand in hand, and it's just a great way of learning while translating poetry. I think if you set out to translate a poem into your own language, you read as carefully as you would have never done before, because you have to learn about all the tricks and the methods, and have to find out where, what movement of vowels is there, what rhyme structure, what little metrical tricks the poet employs. So you read as carefully as you would never read when just reading and enjoying a poem as a reader. And that means that if you pick the poets you love, and that's what I do as well, I just adore certain poets and then choose to translate their work. I read them as carefully as possible, and I learn from them. I learn from those great masters. I choose to translate into my own language. And there is an influence, of course, and I would hesitate to write a poem on the very same day that I have translated Ted Hughes or somebody else, because I'm directly under their spell, as it were. But still, learning from them and learning how they do that, how they do it, how they create this second-rate magic that a poem is wonderful. A wonderful addition to writing yourself, for me.
I'm in a quite unique situation with translation, because I'm a poet who would call herself as a poet without a mother tongue. So being in translation is just my existential state. I grew up Russian speaking, but I never write in my first language. So the two languages I write in are both learned languages, and both languages that I know very imperfectly. And my Russian is also very imperfect because it's Belarusian Russian. And I had the experience of translating a Russian poet, and in our conversations about her work, I felt how much our Russian is different, and what a big gap is between our, because my Russian is the Russian of a person for whom it was not the language for centuries, right? So it's the English that is spoken in Anglophone African countries, or in the Anglophone Caribbean, or it's the English of the Irish. So my Russian is like that. It's not the Russian of Russia. And so, but I didn't know it until until I spoke to actual Russians in depth about poetry. And so I write in two learned languages, learned as an adult, Belarusian and English. So writing process for me is always a slow process of translation from being tongueless into some kind of any tongue that will be merciful to me. And I enjoy it a lot. I could not imagine living just in one language, being monolingual. I imagine it as a very claustrophobic linguistic situation. It's like linguistic claustrophobia. So I move between languages constantly, and I do not feel like I know any of them, which could be very frustrating at times. But because poetry, for me, is a very slow writing process, very intimate. So this is one English that I speak on the stage, but when English and I are in the same room together and nobody see what we're doing together, it's a very different relationship between us, between language and a poet. I love translating poets, dead and alive. I love conversations between poets. I think that it's a way of close reading a poem that does not match any other reading. And also as a poet, I'm obsessed with repetition. Repetition is just a symptom maybe of being an obsessive personality. And I think of translation as a repetition. I just want to repeat.
Do you self-translate? Do you translate
So
yourself?
I mean,
Or do
I
you write different poems?
I write. And
Just different poems in Belarusian, different poems in English?
I write in two languages, yes. Or I would translate between them, but I consider it both translation and writing. There is no hierarchy for me between original or translation. It's just me moving between two languages and seeing which one is more merciful to me today.
Let me ask you this. I often translate my Greek poems into English and my English poems into Greek, and every time I do that, the language demands a different turn of the poem to me. So the poems are entirely different. They might end in a different way. They might go to a different place. If they're a narrative in one, maybe the voice, the main voice might die, and the other may stay alive, but it's the language that pushes me to do that. Does that happen to you?
Yeah, and that's why I like to translate when the poem is not done yet. Because it allows me to return. So I start translating whenever I stop, and I stop many times. I stop, and then I think, well, I walked myself into a wall, say, in English. And then I start translating into Belarusian, and I'm hoping that Belarusian is going to walk me out. And then I bring that into English and I move between them freely. And whatever language shows, because every poem is full of possibilities. You know, we can write a poem endlessly. I can write one poem endlessly, just returning to it and just pushing onto, with my finger, into what I think is a wall, but maybe in a particular spot, it will turn out to be just paper. And I'm gonna pierce through and move further. And so it's just a matter of patience, actually, of returning to the same poem and seeing whether there is still room to move forward and deeper and into more interesting places. And translation then becomes the device that allows me to do it. People like to say that things are lost, in translation, or that, well, this doesn't sound very well, perhaps it's a bad translation. People love to blame translators. But what I discovered through this process is that often translation is bad because the original is not that great. Right? Often we have a great emotional attachment to the original and we do not see it very clearly. But translation is a great test. Because a thought and image, they're translatable, even if they're translatable badly. I love to read a bad translation because you see a mind struggling with the impossible, and I love to see that. Yes, that's what I'm there for, to encounter another person struggling with language and the world. So all of that is just, yes, this kind of fun and games.
There's a lovely cartoon dedicated to a German translator, Harry Rowohlt, where two people are standing in a bookstore and looking at the books, and the one is saying to his friend, "You have to read this book in Harry Rowohlt's translation. Too much is lost in the original," which is a lovely dedication to a poem. But I'm envious of the process of your writing, because basically you get the best of two worlds, right?
Yes.
This phenomenon that you are pushed into other realms when translating. Also because idioms are never the same, and you have to work with the imagery or the facts of an idiom in another language, which mean the same thing but use different imagery in the other language. Yes. It's fascinating. Yes. But translating a poem, you're forced to, in a way, stay truthful nevertheless. So you have to work with it in a very confined room. But you basically have an open end and can go back and forth and get the best of two worlds. That's enviable, I think, and a fascinating process.
Well, I'd like to add something, which is I think it's quite important. But when you translate someone who is a living person, right, you have the opportunity to directly ask some things, and there's a dialogue running through the translation. So actually, you're being lucky because you can, work, cooperate on a text, and you can discuss the same text. Whereas when the poet is dead, you're kind of alone, in a different room, a different space, and it's sometimes harder to do so. What Kristali told about translating yourself, self-translation, I think it's the good thing with self-translation is that you can take the liberty to do whatever you want to, because you actually know what you meant, what you think you know what you were talking about in the poem, so you feel more free to rearrange and restructure and find the analogies of the languages, because it's not about mirroring the meanings and the words. So it's very interesting. Language is a living thing. So yeah.
Not only do you know what you meant, but it's you are free to veer away from what you meant. That's what I meant in a different language. It sings to you differently, so it takes you different places. But since Valžina talked about the fact that she doesn't write in her first spoken language, Russian. In a sense, Evtichia, you don't write in your original vernacular either, in your spoken first language. In the way, I'm assuming that when you grew up in Cyprus, you would speak Cypriot Greek, right? And it would be different from the Greek that you learned at school, which is essentially the Greek that you're talking to us now that you live in Greece, and the Greek that you write in. And I'm wondering, has there ever been an idea in you of writing into the spoken idiom of your mother tongue? And if not, why not?
Oh, thank you for the question. It's quite interesting. I'm not sure I can actually answer in a direct way. Okay, I was born in Cyprus. I was raised in Cyprus. I lived there until I was 18 years old. In everyday life, we speak in the Cypriot dialect, and we use that the official written language is Greek, the official, and public language. When I went to school, it was around, I think, 10, 12 years after the Turkish invasion in 1974. So some teachers, most of them, wouldn't allow us to speak in the Cypriot dialect. And at the same time, there were these, we had these notebooks with a slogan on the cover that was then, the slogan was then "No, I won't forget," meaning that we shouldn't forget the Turkish invasion, we shouldn't forget of the people killed and the people missing. And that was a historical experience. I wasn't born when the invasion, happened. So on the one hand, we had this obligation never to forget something we never experienced, and at the same time, we were encouraged, that's a nice way of putting it, not to think of our mother country, think of Greece as our mother country. So it was a very confusing experience because you had a different life out of the classroom and a different language, and at the same time a different language that was official and a different language that was personal or whatever. So I grew up with this, as I said before, this feeling of having suffered as others. So at the same time, I had this feeling of shame that I was born in a very small island and divided island. So it was a confusing cultural identity now that I come to think about it, because at the time I couldn't actually realize these things. So actually I grew up with a great love for Greece. I think that was encouraged due to my experiences. And then I moved to Greece and I gained citizenship along with the Cypriot one. So I became a poet in Greece, actually. So to answer the question, that I haven't actually used the Cypriot dialect in a poem, but I think that if I lived in Cyprus, I would definitely do. A lot of Cypriot writers are using excellently, they're combining the Cypriot dialect with the standard Greek. But I think that the identity and ethnicity and all these things belonging in a country, they don't actually, they're not always linked to language and the dialect. There are other ways of showing your, expressing your identity or your original, the way, the place you were born in language. There's tone, there's accent, there's imagery, there's traumas and all these things. There are indirect ways that express the feeling of being, Cypriot, for example, in my case. So I'll give you an example on what I mean. In my latest book, there is this 2 lines about lemon blossoms and red tulips that my copy editor wanted me to just remove from the poem because, honestly, there weren't anything special, but I insisted on keeping them. because they reminded me of Cyprus. So I had this. I didn't know why they reminded me of Cyprus, but I was lucky enough to have this friend of mine from Cyprus who asked whether the poem is about Cyprus, and said no, actually it's about fires and destroying our lands and whatever. And she said no. Well, there are these two lines that I think about Cyprus, and she said, well, I think that the posters we had at school showing like the places under occupation, like Lapithos and Karpasia. So probably these memories you had as a child that were just, they decided to become part of the poem. So this is a little lovely thing that I don't really know how the secret identity is expressed in poetry, but I think at some point you can actually acknowledge it and find out and discover how things work.
That's interesting. There's a Darrell book called The Bitter Lemons of Cyprus.
Yeah.
So yeah, other people associate those lemons with Cyprus too. Jan, the almost next to last question goes out to you, and it does have to do with language. Have you ever thought about writing poetry in another language than your German? And first of all, have you? Have you ever thought about it? What do you think about this play between languages?
Well, I have certainly thought about the process involved in writing in another language and the pleasures that there must be. And I know, of course, all the famous authors who have chosen another language to write in, Samuel Beckett and all the others, and that is fascinating, and I see why you would do it. But I've never done that myself. I'm sure I could write a poem in English, but I'm afraid that I would be too easily satisfied. I think I would be too happy to have written something at all and stop too early. By early, it means it would stop before the essential process of criticizing your own work sets in, which in German is a natural thing to do. I would write something and then criticize myself severely and let it stay there and linger for a long time or hang it on the wall like a good piece of bacon and wait for a long time till it's ripened. And I would not do that in English. I would say, this is a lovely poem. I succeeded in writing something in English and would not be critical of my own poem. So that's my fear. And also I think, although I do speak English and I love the English language, I'm sure there would come a point which might not be a bad thing, but would make me nervous, a point where I would write something and a native speaker of English would say, yeah, that's not wrong. But I think we wouldn't say it like that. And that sort of intimate knowledge of language and the sort of natural approach to a language and the instinct in choosing the right register would be something I'd miss when I'd write in English. But it can be a beautiful thing too,
exactly.
Of course.
Imagine how creative that would be, what a creative addition that would be to the body of English poetry.
That's why I said I was envious of people who can do it or who are maybe taking the risk of doing it.
Yeah, I have a hard time imagining a situation in which a poet in a linguistic situation like Jan would decide to write in another language, because I think that a decision like that has to have particular circumstances, historical, linguistical circumstances. I think that something has to be at stake in the choice. There has to be an urgency that is beyond, like, I can do it, right? Because of course, one could, but I think that there needs to be an urgency there. So I do not write in English because I thought I could, but because I do not write in Belarusian because I thought I could. There are different historical circumstances. And in Belarus, it was very interesting to listen to FT here talk about language situation. In Belarus, language is very political, and there is a lot of historical weight and historical trauma associated with the choice of language. And so that's what at stake there. And but then also it's a language for which there are so few translators. So at a certain point, a Belarusian poet living abroad finds herself in a situation where she has to either trust the translators or self-translate. And for me, it started with just practical necessity and then turned into this process, because I like to control. So if I would have never allowed an English language translator to do their work on their own.
Okay.
So I would have always interfered and all of that. So it's easier then to do it, but it is actually, I said that it's fun and games, but it's not, of course. It's the opposite of fun and games. It's a very long process in which one fails for many, many days and sometimes for many months, and feels for many months that she's not a poet at all, precisely because she has no language. And then always at the very end, when I'm about to give up, is when there is some kind of breakthrough that happens.
Mm.
But I think that there are more and more poets like me because of the kind of various migrations that are happening in the world, political migrations, and poets who want to speak themselves on behalf of themselves, and they are either bilingual poets or trilingual poets, or they self-translate. But there is a historical urgency there and political urgency to do that.
I can see your point completely in necessity and urgency, but I think, I mean, the worst thing, of course, is if somebody decides to write in another language precisely because you lack the critical approach to your own poetry, just in order to create something in a quick way and feel you've done something worthwhile as a gimmick.
Yeah.
But I could accept a necessity of strangeness, of estrangement.
Yeah,
I mean, we all as learners of a foreign language know the pleasures of discovering things that a native speaker wouldn't discover because they're too close and too intimate with their own language.
Yeah.
Idioms you read in another language, in French or Greek or English, and say, this is very strange. Where does it come from? You suddenly discover that the words quince and coincidence create a coincidence and create wordplays that a native speaker would never do, maybe. And this sort of strangeness in watching and grasping a foreign language would be urgency and necessity enough, I think. There would be an argument for writing in another language. Precisely this process of understanding and being a stranger and trying to having to get to terms with the bizarre features of a foreign language, which can be a foundation for good poetry, of course.
Our national poet Solomos actually used.
Our national poet actually used Italian and Greek language.
Right.
So it's this uncertainty that made his writings very appealing and very interesting and very unique. So you can see him writing in a different way as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Jan. I think that that's urgent enough to feel that your own language at some point has failed something. And this is what I would want to be so interested in, to say, what happened? What happened in that relationship between a poet and his native language that led him to that? And estrangement is, I think, is at the heart of all poetry, and estrangement from one's own language. That's why I think often one doesn't think automatically to start writing in a foreign language, because it is that sense of estrangement from the familiar that is already always there, and a poet always turns his own language into a foreign language.
I do not want to misquote Samuel Beckett, whom we've mentioned before, but I think he, when asked why he wrote in French, said, because I do not have a mastery of French, which is, I mean, obviously he was a great writer of French, but maybe this is precisely the point, that you don't have this natural mastery, but in a foreign language, sort of delivering yourself to that language.
You see the role in you?
Yeah, I just have a short comment, because I was saying how a poet makes her own or his own language a bit foreign, and I wanted to tie it all the way back to how we started our conversation when you were asking about poetry seeking a bigger audience and how we convince more people to read poetry. And I thought this is exactly why most people do not read poetry, because it presents their language to them as foreign, and suddenly they do not recognize their own language. They read a poem written in their own language and they feel completely estranged from it. And so it's a very natural reaction not to like poetry.
Well, my very final question, well, first of all, having listened to this conversation very carefully, I can't help feeling that Plato must have been crazy when he wrote that he would excommunicate poets from his ideal state, a state that should be run only by philosophers. By the way, both Erkiki and I have studied philosophy as our degrees at university, and obviously both of us have found it lacking when it comes to talking about the world. That's why we turn to poetry. So it's interesting that Plato would excommunicate the poets from the ideal polity, because what we've been talking about is certainly a great way to grapple with the world and with putting up a polity of conversational people. But in order to make this, to open this up, I have asked you to think about your very favorite poem in the entire world. You don't have to say it, you know, to say it out loud. But what is it, and why is it that poem? It can be, of course, from any language in the world. Do you know? Have you thought about it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm not sure if I can think of two poems. I'm not sure if they're one of my favorite poems, but they seem to follow me a lot, like a spectrum or whatever. So one poem was written by the Polish poet Wisława Szymborska, and it's called, I think I first read it in English actually. It's called Never Twice. So it's all about following Heraclitus, that we cannot repeat our experiences. They just happen once in a certain way. So I kind of think of the poem as a fundamental truth about life, that is, it's at the same time an improvisation and as well with play. So we improvise and we actually perform at the same time. And that's one poem. I think we can Google it and we can find the poem. And the other one is a poem by Cavafy. It's one of the unpublished ones. It's called Ktiste, meaning builders. And it's all about generations that work for progress in order to offer a better life for next generations, where apparently this is a vain effort, their efforts are undone. So it's this repetition of an effort that collapses in the future. It's not a very optimistic point, but it's a very, I think it's good to know that whatever we do, we can also do just for enjoying it and loving it and just supporting it now.
Did you do your homework?
Well, I could say something, yeah,
Yeah.
if you want to think a little bit longer.
Well, I didn't do my homework, but and it would be impossible to pick just one poem because I read a lot of poetry and return to many poets for various reasons. Actually, Wisława Szymborska is a poet that I return to when I tire of all poetry and I want all the poets of the world to just shut up. For me, that's when I go to Szymborska and she talks to me. Another Polish poet would be Anna Swieszczyńska. In English translation, she's known as Anna Swir, and her book Building the Barricades is one of my favorite books of poetry. It's a poetry book about the Warsaw Uprising. And that Anna Swieszczyńska lived through, and it took her 30 years to write the book. So all of the other poets have written their World War II poetry books, and the world has moved on from it, and that's when she wrote her book Building the Barricades. It consists of very, very short poems that are like photographs. There are no embellishments in these poems. There are no metaphors, no philosophical ideas. They're just very short records. And because it is such clear and precise, no bullshit book, I return to it when I tire of all the noise. Inge Christensen's Alphabet will be another book of that kind. It just feels like all the noise of the world, you found safety from it. And then, because I'm in Greece, I would also say Kavafi. And I love Kavafi's erotic poems a lot. So all of his poems about the rooms where he made love many years ago with some young men, all of the poems about some tavern where while the waiter was sleeping, he had sex with a stranger at noon, all the poems about unmade beds that he's thinking about many years later. I love them, and I go into those rooms with him. Earlier, Young was talking about the pleasure of reading old poets today. And when I want to read about myself today, I never go to myself or to my contemporaries, but I seek always a poet long dead. And I want to feel understood by the poet. And often it's a poet from a completely different century, different country, different language, and different experience. And yet I feel understood. And in Kavafi's rooms of lovemaking, I feel understood and talked to.
Well, it's a very difficult question, of course, and as the reading goes on, and there's so many discoveries to be made, one could say that I have a new favorite poem every month, because I discover new poets, contemporary or dead poets, but there's really so many poets or poems I could name, like Hugh Christensen, of course, or also speaking of Herbert, it's James Heaney, or Rilke, for that matter, but I think I would pick a poem by the great Welsh poet Dylan Thomas, because he really was the first poet I adored when I was starting to read and to write poetry. So I always go back to his work, and I would maybe pick Fern Hill or Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, two of his most famous pieces, which are unbelievably beautiful and witty and full of, I think you could say, magic.
Well, thank you very much for being with us today. Valžina Mort, Jan Wagner, FTG Panayotou, I am in awe of all three of you, and I thank you very much for being with us during this conversation, for being here in Athens, and gracing us with your presence during the 11th Athens International Poetry Festival. Thank you, audience, for being here. See you soon. Thanks.